They ran the board, or so they thought. Their confidence wasn't earned, it was inherited, passed down through systems, power, privilege, or pure timing. They were the gatekeepers, the narrators, the referees who rewrote the rules mid-game and dared you to complain. And you did once. You begged for fairness. You pleaded for clarity. You asked why the field felt so tilted, and they laughed, because they thought you hadn't learned yet. But what they missed, what they never paused to consider, was the one rule you mastered while they rehearsed their performance. You don't have to play by a system once you understand it better than the architect. You stopped begging. You started building. And when they turned back to see you gone from the board, they didn't realize you'd already moved the game to another level, one they weren't qualified to compete in. They valued control over clarity. Every move they made was rooted in keeping you guessing, tethered, dependent. They fed you disinformation like breadcrumbs, not to teach, but to train. You weren't supposed to win. You were supposed to stay busy trying. Every time you got close to understanding, they changed the rules again. But what they failed to notice is that you stopped trying to win. You started watching. With every betrayal, every contradiction, every micro shift in their tone, you took notes. Not to outwit them, to outgrow them. They were busy performing strategy. You were absorbing reality. And that shift, that subtle transfer of awareness, is what tore their illusion apart. Because control without insight is fragile. And once you saw the strings, you didn't want to pull them. You wanted to walk away from the puppet show altogether. They built their power on assumption. They assumed you wanted approval. They assumed you needed access. They assumed you were willing to betray yourself for the illusion of progress. But while they flaunted their position, you found the loophole. The rule beneath all the rules. The one they never teach. Because it breaks the entire game. You discovered the art of not needing the table they fight over. You learned to hold power without performance. To know without announcing. To build without broadcasting. And that terrified them. Because once someone no longer craves the prize being dangled, they become ungovernable. You became sovereign the moment you stopped playing. They operated on the belief that visibility equaled victory. That whoever has seen more, heard more, praised more, has already won. They needed an audience. They needed witnesses. They needed noise. But you didn't. You chose invisibility. You chose the long road, the private grind, the one with no recognition, no applause, no handouts. While they sought status, you sought substance. And in doing so, you outpaced them in a way they didn't even notice, until the consequences began to show. While they were building personas, you were building presence. And presence doesn't need performance to be felt. It reshapes rooms, rewrites expectations. You didn't defeat them by outshining them. You dismantled their glow by no longer reflecting it. The rule you mastered was patience. Not waiting. Strategic patience. The kind that watches people write their own collapse and never intervenes. You saw how fragile their confidence was. How much it depended on your reaction. How every move they made was a test. An attempt to maintain their myth of superiority. But you didn't push back. You didn't fight for your space at the table. You let them overplay. You let them believe. And in their belief, they made fatal errors. Because people who think they can't lose always become careless. And when the moment came, when the board tipped in your favor, you didn't celebrate. You just nodded. Because you knew the win had already happened long ago, quietly, internally, invisibly. They were architects of illusion, masters of theater. But the flaw in every manipulator is this. They assume you're addicted to the stage. They didn't realize you could burn it down from the back row. Your power wasn't in your voice. It was in your presence. You didn't need to declare checkmate. You became it. They couldn't anticipate your moves because you weren't making moves anymore. You were becoming, changing the terrain itself. So while they were busy predicting plays, you were reshaping the board entirely. That's what made you lethal. You didn't come to play. You came to evolve. Every time they mocked you, every time they underestimated your silence, they wrote your rise into existence. Their arrogance funded your awareness. Their shortcuts sharpened your integrity. Their betrayals became blueprints. And now, they sit confused, wondering how someone they dismissed as too soft, or too slow, or too quiet became a force they can't bend. They still don't get it. They think it was luck, timing. Coincidence. Because they don't understand transformation without trauma, power without drama. They don't understand how someone can build in the shadows and emerge without needing revenge. But that was your move all along. The move they never prepared for. The one that didn't come from fury, but from freedom. They were too loud to hear it. The sound of your shift. The way you started showing up differently. More direct. Less available. More grounded. Less agreeable. You started saying less but meaning more. You stopped explaining and started embodying. That's what shook them. Not your words. Your alignment. They could counter your arguments. They couldn't counter your presence. Because presence, true presence, cannot be faked. It can't be borrowed. It's earned in the fire of solitude, in the hours of becoming when no one claps. And now that presence walks into every room before you do, reminding them that the rules they played by no longer apply. Their empire was made of mirrors, and for a long time, you mistook reflection for truth. But the moment you stopped seeing yourself through their lens, you collapsed their foundation. You didn't need to confront them. You just needed to see clearly. That was the rule they missed. Clarity is lethal, because once a person sees the game for what it is, they no longer play it, they transcend it. You didn't defeat them. You left them behind. And now they're trying to figure out why their tactics stopped working, why their influence feels thinner, why their words don't land the same. It's simple. You stopped dancing in their circus. You became the storm outside of it. They were obsessed with binaries, win or lose, alpha or victim, loud or irrelevant. Their entire identity was stitched from clear lines and loud victories, as if life were that simple, as if every situation were waiting for a decisive blow or a roaring applause. But you didn't live in that world. You never needed the whole room to clap to know you'd said something eternal. You never needed a trophy to understand your value. While they chased clarity like addicts, you learned to breathe in ambiguity. You navigated moments they didn't know how to read. The pauses in conversations, the shifts in energy, the sharpness and softness. They wanted rules. You embodied rhythm. And that's why they misread you. That's why they underestimated you. Because they thought the absence of noise meant the absence of strength. But in nuance, you built your edge. They couldn't see the war behind your quiet smile. They thought control was intelligence. They thought whoever could command the most attention, maintain the tightest grip, craft the most rigid plans, was the one with power. But control is often a fear response wearing a crown. It doesn't adapt, it overcompensates. And while they wrapped themselves in strategies, titles, and timelines, you studied the shadows they ignored. You noticed the hesitation behind their confidence, the fragility beneath their dominance. They mistook your observation for indecision. But you weren't slow, you were precise. You noticed the subtext. You heard the fear in their laughter, the envy in their praise. You saw the contradiction between their words and their energy. And instead of calling it out, you let it sit. You let them become haunted by the fact that you never flinched. They couldn't understand it. You didn't give them a yes or a no. You gave them silence so sharpened it cut through their illusion of control. They mistook your adaptability for inconsistency. Because their minds couldn't handle duality, they labeled you unstable when you changed direction. But you were fluid, not lost. You weren't dancing for approval. You were adjusting your angle to see better. While they were busy holding onto one mask for the sake of appearing real, you embraced complexity. You understood that true power isn't about being rigid. It's about being rooted deep enough that you can bend without breaking. That confused them. They were looking for a pattern, a template, but you weren't repeating, you were evolving. And the human eye, trained on predictability, cannot comprehend something in constant elevation. They clung to certainty like it was oxygen. They needed a clear villain, a clear hero, a clear win. But you dissolved that script the moment you stopped explaining. You were both shadow and sun. You could make someone feel safe and dangerous in the same sentence. You didn't pick a side. You became the mirror that revealed theirs. That's what made you unnerving. You didn't fight for dominance. You outgrew the need to be right, and that made you unreadable. They couldn't weaponize your intentions because you didn't leave them exposed. You didn't overshare. You moved through rooms with the elegance of someone who already saw the ending, but chose to let everyone else believe the story was still unfolding. They overplayed every interaction. They thought louder was stronger, firmer was wiser. But nuance has a weight that can crush those who can only operate in extremes. You heard what wasn't said, you understood what wasn't shown, and you acted accordingly. They mocked your silence until it turned into consequence. They misread your restraint until it became presence. You never raised your voice. You never struck first. But every time you didn't respond, the silence you left behind rearranged their sense of control. Because the truth they feared wasn't that you were emotional. It was that you had mastered when not to be. They couldn't see the intelligence in your flexibility. They thought detachment meant indifference. That stillness meant weakness. But only someone who doesn't flinch when their name is dragged can be trusted with power. You let them misread you, not out of passivity, but precision, because nuance rewards those who wait. And when you waited, they kept exposing themselves, word by word, gesture by gesture, until they were standing in a spotlight they built for you, with every mask slipping, every illusion cracking. You didn't need to destroy them. You just had to be patient enough for their contradictions to collide in public. They tried to label you, tried to shrink you into something consumable. But nuance is not digestible to shallow minds. You gave them paradoxes. You were kind but unyielding, gentle but immune to guilt. They came for your softness, thinking it meant surrender, but walked into a presence that bent like silk and struck like iron. That psychological dissonance. They couldn't hold it. Because you didn't resolve into something obvious. You weren't a clean story. You were a slow burn. And in that slowness, they began to overheat. Not because you attacked, but because they were never built to withstand subtlety. They spent so long building thrones on assumptions that they forgot how to read silence. And silence is where you lived, where you trained, where you constructed the frameworks of your strength. While they were performing, you were observing. While they were broadcasting, you were refining. While they were busy looking impressive, you were becoming irreplaceable. Their control needed an audience. Your power needed no one. That's why when things began to fall apart, you weren't panicking. You had already rehearsed solitude, already written your escape route. You were never attached to the stage. They just assumed you were part of the play. They never expected someone to master both edges, empathy and strategy. Most people either care too much or manipulate too well, but you existed at the intersection. You saw clearly, but still forgave. You felt deeply, but still moved on. And when they tried to provoke a reaction, to tip your balance, they found something terrifying instead, a mind that understood them better than they understood themselves. You were aware, entirely, of every flaw, every trigger, every trap, but you didn't flinch. You used that knowledge not for revenge, but for redirection, and that shook them. Because it meant you weren't just surviving, you were transcending. They believed in spectacle. They chased visibility as if presence only mattered when it could be measured in applause, in likes, in headlines. Influence, to them, was about proximity to noise. They moved like peacocks, flashing feathers, selling certainty, mistaking attention for authority. But you never fought for the center. You didn't need the microphone. You understood that real influence is not in the volume of your voice, but in the gravitational pull of your silence. They kept looking for your crown, not realizing you wore it in your composure. You didn't compete for stage time. You let the silence fill with meaning. And when people leaned in, you taught them something no loud campaign ever could, that the most profound shifts are often felt, not seen. They shouted, you whispered. They performed, you observed. They took pride in being seen first, but you were remembered last. Influence isn't about being the one speaking. It's about being the one people think of when the noise fades. That's what scared them. Their influence expired with the applause. Yours began when the curtain dropped. Because you weren't addicted to being visible. You were focused on being undeniable. And when you moved, you didn't announce. You allowed your presence to shift the entire room without forcing a single eye to look your way. That was your power. That was your edge. The kind of command that isn't taught, only earned through presence, integrity, and the unshakable confidence of someone who no longer needs to be seen to be known. They thought the world would orbit the loudest voice. So they shouted until their throats bled, trying to echo their names into permanence. But you carved your legacy through restraint. You chose impact over impression. You didn't influence, quietly, strategically. You never tried to dominate the conversation. You became the conversation after everyone else stopped talking. They remembered you not because you demanded attention, but because your absence held weight. You weren't the spark. You were the air that made the fire burn deeper. And now, even in rooms where your name isn't spoken, your energy dictates the flow. They kept trying to see your strategy. They couldn't, because you weren't playing to be watched. You weren't interested in optics. You were mastering depth. You planted words like seeds, rarely noticed at first, but impossible to ignore once they took root. And by the time they realized what you'd done, the shift had already happened. The dynamic had already turned. The game had already changed. You weren't reactive. You were inevitable. Their spotlight burned fast and fragile. Your influence moved like gravity, silent, consistent, inescapable. They still talk louder, but now they feel quieter in your presence. They didn't understand how someone who didn't demand the room could still control it. They didn't grasp that the most potent power doesn't scream. It stares. It waits. It reshapes expectations without confrontation. You moved without resistance, which made you impossible to block. Because people can prepare for a threat. They cannot prepare for an energy that melts their defenses before they even realize they're exposed. You didn't need to impose your voice. You let others trip over their need to be heard. You didn't need attention. You let attention become a symptom of your existence. They called it luck. They called it mystery. But deep down, it unnerved them. That someone could walk into a room and shift the tone without opening their mouth. That someone could command respect without shouting credentials. You prove that the most dangerous people are the ones who don't need to win the moment. They win the aftermath. You weren't chasing moments. You were building memory. And when the lights went out and the crowd dispersed, you were the only one still echoing in their minds. Because what you did couldn't be dismissed. It was too subtle to resist, too real to forget. They couldn't figure out why you weren't anxious to prove your worth. That's how they'd always played the game. Performance, proximity, pressure. But you moved like someone who had already seen the ending. You didn't react. You anticipated. You didn't chase connection. You embodied magnetism. They tried to pin you down with analysis, only to find you'd slip through the cracks, redefined the frame, and made the entire structure irrelevant. You never needed to say, "Watch me." You were already being studied, quietly, constantly. By people who sensed what the loud ones missed. You were different, because you weren't trying to be powerful. You already were. They valued volume because they feared stillness. But you found stillness intoxicating. You lived in it. You let it sharpen your perception. You listened until you could hear intention beneath words, insecurity beneath posturing. You navigated conversations like a surgeon, cutting through noise, bypassing ego, touching the nerve. You didn't have to fight for a response. You let silence do the work. You knew that when people can't read you, they reveal themselves. So you stayed quiet. Not out of weakness, but out of design. And every time they tried to bait you into loudness, you met them with elegance. You let them exhaust themselves trying to define you, while you rewrote the entire dynamic from beneath their awareness. They assumed silence meant hesitation, but yours was surgical. Yours was a weapon. You withheld, not because you didn't know what to say, but because they didn't deserve access to your inner world. You understood the economy of energy. You chose where to spend your words and when to disappear entirely. Because true influence is not measured by presence alone. It's measured by what shifts in your absence. And now they're beginning to see it. How their confidence cracks without your validation. How their narratives unravel without your participation. You didn't need to overpower them. You just stopped feeding them. They stood taller than you once, not by merit, but by scaffolding. Position propped them up, not presence. They leaned on reputations inherited, alliances borrowed, noise manufactured. Their name rang because others echoed it, not because it carried weight on its own. And for a while, you watched it all unfold. The illusion of permanence, the performance of authority, the fragile architecture of borrowed power pretending to be legacy. They had the crowd, they had the angle, but they lacked one thing you had been quietly constructing: rootedness. You weren't in a rush. You didn't chase the spotlight or the stamp of approval. You were too busy building something they didn't understand. Not image, identity. And identity cannot be revoked. They decorated themselves with borrowed words, recycled scripts, second-hand insight. Their entire existence relied on being seen standing next to someone louder. But you weren't trying to be seen. You were becoming undeniable. While they chased affiliations, you courted solitude. You went where few dare to go, into the dark corridors of your own psyche. You met your flaws, named your patterns, dissected your beliefs. And what came out of that depth was not a performance. It was presence. That's why they couldn't copy it. You built your power in silence, brick by brick, forged from pain, refined in stillness. Their power needed applause. Yours needed only time. They underestimated the difference between position and permanence. They had reach, but no resonance. Their success was held up by perception. Yours was anchored in self-awareness. And now that time has passed, their noise is fading. Their declarations ring hollow. Their strategies crumble under pressure. But your name still moves in circles you've never stepped into. Your decisions still ripple through rooms you left behind. Because when you build instead of borrow, you don't need to remind people who you are. They feel it, long after you've gone silent, long after they've stopped speaking. They dressed up their borrowed strength as charisma, spoke louder when they were questioned, sated others when they lacked originality. But there's a reason their empires feel empty now. Because you cannot fake weight, you cannot outsource soul. And they never realized that the very people they tried to impress with borrowed wisdom were silently watching you. Watching how your words felt heavier, how your silences spoke louder, how your choices were stitched together with conviction. You didn't need a tribe to validate your path. You became the blueprint others now quietly mimic. They mocked you when you were quiet, when you were missing from the celebration, absent from the network, slow to respond. But what they didn't see was that you weren't lagging, you were layering. Depth takes time. Substance moves slowly. While they plastered their walls with accolades, you were pouring cement into your foundation. And now, their walls echo. Yours withstands storms. That's the difference between borrowed noise and built power. One evaporates in silence. The other expands in it. They had everything you didn't. Visibility, access, applause. But you had what they feared. Endurance. Because borrowed power runs on maintenance. It demands constant affirmation. It has to be renewed, reposted, reshared. But built power grows in the dark. It sharpens in solitude. It multiplies in reflection. That's why they burn out while you burn brighter. You never chased momentum. You built rhythm. And rhythm outlasts all spectacle. They thought winning was about being first. You knew it was about being final. You moved like someone with nothing to prove and everything to become. And that contradiction, they couldn't understand it. Because they needed audience to feel alive. You found aliveness in alignment. And alignment breeds something louder than performance. Clarity. You didn't need to manipulate perception. You let your energy do the speaking. And now they watch as people gravitate toward you, even when you don't speak. Because real power, the kind that's built not borrowed, doesn't need a stage, it becomes the structure. They talk about you now in fragments. Whispered curiosity. Sudden respect. Because it's dawning on them that you didn't vanish. You matured. You didn't withdraw, you refined. And the echo they hear isn't your voice. It's the impact of your presence long after you stopped offering it. They don't know how to replicate it. Because it wasn't branding. It wasn't strategy. It was built. Brick by honest brick. Every scar. Every shift. Every choice you made when no one was clapping. You earned what they rented. And the difference echoes with every silent step you take. You proved something they never considered. That strength is not about visibility. It's about roots. You went deeper while they reached higher. And now, their branches break under the weight of a truth they can't deny. You didn't bloom in the spring. You bloomed in drought. And your growth, it didn't need fertilizer, just faith, repetition, precision. That's why you still rise while they recite. You grew from within, while they leaned on everything outside of themselves. And now that the wind has changed, their scaffolding shivers while your roots anchor further. They feared direct conflict because confrontation threatens illusion. It forces people to reveal whether their strength is rooted in truth or just theatricality. They built their reputations on avoidance, passive gestures, vague responses, social cues that promised much but stood for nothing. They wielded ambiguity like a weapon, hoping you would back down out of uncertainty. And for a while you did. You played polite. You paused to preserve peace. You held back because you believed maturity meant always choosing quiet over friction. But then you realized, silence without power is submission. So instead of confronting them in the ways they expected, you went deeper. You mastered the hidden current. While they ran from the fire of confrontation, you learned to control the temperature of the entire room,